By now, you've probably heard this quote from the Anthropic CEO.
If I look at coding, programming, which is one area where AI is making the most progress, what we are finding is we are not far from a world, I think we'll be there in 3 to 6 months, where AI is writing 90% of the code.
I get why you might not agree with this.
And then in 12 months, we may be in a world where AI is writing essentially all of the code.
I could never have imagined myself agreeing with or defending a quote like this, even like 2 months ago. But the more I've gone down this chaotic AI pipeline, the more I'm starting to see the hidden truths of these statements. What Dario's saying here sounds terrible. It sounds like all of our jobs are about to be replaced with AI. I don't think it's that simple. And honestly, the second half of the statement is kind of garbage. But the essence of it is hinting at something really, really interesting about how code will be written in the future. And we're going to get to that in just a second, because if I'm going to pay my bills and I'm not going to be able to write code anymore, someone's going to have to. We'll be right back. I need to vent for a second. I've been trying to find a good way to take the data coming from AI APIs like OpenAI and get it to my user immediately while also storing it in a database. Everything I've tried is a mess and ends up just sending way too much data to the user or not keeping things in sync at all. Today's sponsor is Convex, and if I'm honest with you guys, they didn't solve this problem. Keyword didn't, but now they do. I complained about this to the team over there because I wanted to use Convex for T3 chat, and they're making a really, really compelling argument now. The new persistent text streaming component that they built just to demo how to do this right is incredible. And their solution, honestly, it's genius. If your database was to send an update every time the message changed, it would probably send the whole message, not just the little bit of extra text added. And when you're streaming token by token, that is horrible. Their solution is great. When you're streaming it from the server, you get it token by token, the way that feels really good and it updates immediately. But if you lose connection or you open it up in another tab, God, multi-tab is the bane of my existence right now. It just works. It doesn't stream in quite as smooth because it's going sentence by sentence instead of word by word, but it solved all the other problems I have by doing that. And it's, I never thought I would get here, but I feel bad that I'm not using Convex. And sure, they're sponsoring this video, but I have a lot to go think about. If you want to avoid the mistake I probably made here, check them out today at soydev.link/convex. So what the hell is Dario saying here? And why do I think this is in any way, shape, or form a reasonable take? As always, with the spicier takes, I need a diagram because people seem to think I'm smarter when they can look at what I'm thinking instead of just hearing it. 90% of code will be written by AI in the next 3 to 6 months. There's a couple questions we have to ask before this statement can make any sense to us. Question 1 is, what code? Is this code at companies? Is this code on GitHub? Is this code in general? What code are we talking about? Like, what is the bounds that 90% of is going to be covered in 3 to 6 months? Question 2 is, who's writing this code? Is this being written by professional developers? And when I say written, I mean prompted by people who are writing code for a living. Or is it people doing it for fun? Is it people playing around with cursor? Is it AI tools doing it entirely themselves? Who's writing the code that we're talking about here? And 3, most importantly, has this ever happened before? We've all seen Prime's tweets, 22 months into 6 months away from AI stealing your jobs. Because people have been saying this, in 6 months, we won't have dev jobs anymore thing forever. And that's bullshit. If the way you're interpreting what Dario said here is 90% of our work is going away, that is bullshit. And you should be annoyed by that because that is not a statement that makes any sense at all. And I agree, 90% of our work isn't going to be automated in the next 3 to 6 months as developers. That's absurdity. But there is something similar that has happened in the past. Imagine you're around when the language C first came out. When C came out, most of the code we were writing was in obnoxious, horrifying systems like COBOL, or if we wanted actually performant code, we would just write it in assembly. So imagine when C first came out, if you wanted performant code for platforms, you'd have to write assembly. When C first dropped, imagine somebody saying, in 3 to 6 months, 90% of assembly will be written in C. At the time, this would be a nonsense-sounding statement because there are so many devs that are incredible at assembly. There are so many projects in flight that are written in assembly. There is so much work going on in the assembly world. The thought of a new language replacing all of that in a short time frame is just funny. It didn't replace it though. Here's how we have to think about it. If this is the circle of assembly code, and we say 90% of assembly is going to be written in C, what you're thinking is something like this. What you're interpreting us as saying is this part is real assembly, and the rest isn't. The rest is C. And this is how you interpret that statement, that we're taking the assembly code being written right now, and we're splitting a line here where the existing code, where all the stuff in this box here, this is all going to be written in C. Anything that's currently in this box written in assembly, screw you, you're gone. That's going to be compressed in this tiny little thing. That is not what happened. What happened was very different. This is what happened. Assembly, written natively, has become a much smaller portion of the overall native application code space. C greatly expanded the number of people who can program code that operates on a native level. C broke ground in a way unimaginable. It didn't replace 90% of the assembly code. It 10x'd the number of people writing code that compiles to assembly. So it's true that eventually, way over 90% of assembly code is being written in C or things like it, but not because 90% of this bubble was swapped, because the bubble got 10x'd. The number of people writing code that compiled to assembly, be it writing it themselves or writing it in C, got significantly larger. So why are we talking about this right now? A couple months ago, the platform Lovable had an incident. And quick bias checks. I'm an investor in Lovable. I'm also sponsored by them here and there. They don't pay me for anything other than the ad slot, so my bias is what it is, but know that I've worked with these guys in the past. They had an incident in January of this year. They had a GitHub outage. If you're not familiar with Lovable, it's an app generation platform. You tell it to make a thing and it makes it. One of the things they do differently is they back your project on GitHub. So a repo is created that your project is mirrored to, and you can make changes there and see them in Lovable and vice versa. But it means everything deployed on Lovable gets a GitHub repo. The sheer volume of GitHub repos that were being made through Lovable was so absurdly high that GitHub locked them out because there were too many things being created by them. Just for reference, these guys have 500,000 users who are building over 25,000 new projects a day. Do you know how insane that is? 25,000 new projects being initialized and a surprising number of those being deployed every single fucking day. And this is one of the options. We have Lovable, we have Bolt, we have V0, and recently we have a new one I'm invested in, A0, that I'm super hyped about, focus on mobile apps. These guys are awesome. More and more of these platforms are appearing. We also have Same.dev, which was just created by Aiden, the guy who made MillionLint, the React wizard performance guy, also made React Scan. Love Aiden a ton. All of these project generators are generating unbelievable amounts of code. And there are just some numbers that we don't like to think about as developers because most people aren't devs. So any tool that allows for non-devs to do things that traditionally only devs did is going to result in just absurd amounts of stuff happening that wouldn't happen if it was just in the dev world. I experienced this myself when I dropped T3 Chat. Most of our projects, we got a couple hundred to maybe a few thousand users in the first 1 to 2 weeks. T3 Chat got like 100,000 users in the first week because it wasn't just applicable to devs. For every dev, there are hundreds of people who aren't devs and at least a couple dozen that want to do things that devs do but can't. If we were to like diagram out how fast the amount of code in the world is growing, there have been lots of moments where the amount started to ramp up faster. When we had to do punch cards, the amount of people coding and adding code to the world was relatively low. Then assembly happened and chips got more accessible, so it started to go up a little bit faster. Then C happened and it started being taught in schools, and we got easier and easier to make apps. Then the web happened, and all of a sudden, oh, we can build things in ways we never could before. This curve's already too aggressive because we need to get way more aggressive momentarily. The point being here, now that anyone can go type in some text and generate a project with thousands of lines of code, this just happened. We now have significantly increased the amount of code going online every single day. The sheer volume of code going out right now is increasing like it never has before. And if you're using these AI tools, you've felt this some amount yourself. I've never had so many projects on my machine. Obviously, I'm higher than average here because I'm a creator and I'm knitting small things to do demos and stuff here and there. But I'm also building more projects and releasing more individual things than I did in the past by quite a bit. I've put out like 4 or 5 apps in the past few weeks just solving specific problems that I had. And while obviously I'm writing a decent bit of that code myself, most of the starting points aren't written by me. I'll use a tool like V0 Bolt or Lovable to get the first parts put together. I'll use them to generate a component and pull them over. And then once I'm in my editor, I'll use my editor to smooth parts out, make changes, do stuff like that. When I'm using Cursor, I'd say, depending on what the task I'm doing, between like 20% and 70% of my code is probably being generated. If you count the tab completes, as well as the things I'm opening up Composer and the little Command I and Command K views for, depending on the feature I'm working on, it might be a really small amount, like 20%. I'm just using the autocomplete and not much else because the thing I'm working on is complex and it can't figure that out. But when I'm working on other things that are just like big UI overhaul changes, most of my biggest PRs, the T3 chat repo, have been like 80% AI. The small, really hard ones have been closer to 0%, but the big ones have been largely generated. Here's a question I will ask you guys now. If we were to analyze the biggest code base that compiles down to assembly, do you think that code base is written in assembly? Or do you think it's written in C? I hope this is an obvious question. I hope we can all clearly see that C is the answer. And there's a lot of reasons why. When you have a bigger code base, it becomes easier to maintain if you use a higher level language. People clearly agreed that between those two, it is much more likely that C is the thing that has the largest assembly compiled code bases. And it makes intuitive sense for a handful of reasons. The bigger code bases are going to benefit more from the abstraction that C represents. C isn't going to compile to the most optimal assembly code. So it's possibly going to compile things in ways where there is more code in the binary than there would have been if you wrote it yourself. And the people who are working in these giant code bases, like if you have a team with hundreds of people working on the same code base, finding hundreds of people smart enough to do it in assembly and work together, good luck, have fun. In C, much easier. In C++, potentially easier, but it has its own disasters too. The point I'm trying to make here is that as your team gets bigger, as the people contributing become a wider range of people at a wider range of skills, and as the resulting output of what they create getting larger as well, the likelihood they're using these higher level tools goes up. So as unintuitive as it might seem, the larger the code base, the more likely they're using higher level tools. Simply because these abstractions make managing big things easier, and they make the gap between skill levels much better. One of the things Go is actually quite good at is making it so the code that a senior dev writes and that a brand new Go dev writes look relatively similar. Combination of the formatting, the lack of options for a lot of different things. A lot of work was put in to make Go feel consistent across different skill levels and experience levels. Do you see where I'm going with this? As the number of people contributing to a given code base gets larger, as the number of code bases gets larger and the number of devs, in quotes, goes up, the amount of code being created is exponentially increasing, and AI tools are a big part of why that is happening, if not the entirety of why it is happening. So when someone says that 90% of code is being generated with AI, what they mean isn't we're going to stop writing code, all code is going to be AI now. What they mean is the amount of code is going to 10x. The size of these projects is going to keep getting larger. The number of projects is going to keep exponentially increasing. We are quickly approaching a point similar to C, where there is just so much more code that assembly devs are their own weird pocket. And I think that's where we're going right now with AI. While right now, an AI dev that doesn't have real coding experience can't really keep up with devs that do. And you can see this, by the way. Just go to t3.chat and compare the experience you have here to the experience using almost any other similar tool. I used AI to help building a lot of this, believe me, but the important parts AI could not help with at all. And if you compare the experience here to an AI company's experience like DeepSeek, Claude, or even OpenAI, the actual experience using their products is way worse because the people who work on it aren't as focused on building great experiences in the web. They don't have a decade of work doing this. They didn't build Twitch chat and go out of their way to make every single frame respond as quickly as possible and handle thousands of updates per second. If you don't have that experience, there isn't enough public references of that experience to do it well via AI, because the AI cannot be better than effectively the general consensus. If the info doesn't exist in the public domain, it is very unlikely the AI can figure it out. But most of the code we write is code that exists all over the internet. We've had the joke forever in software that like most of dev work is just Googling. I know Prime in particular has always hated this quote, but when you're working in these giant code bases and you're working across many different projects and many different stacks, this can absolutely be the case. The code that you would spend a lot of your time Googling to do can almost all be done with AI now. And the AI will make it so you can skip through the steps of learning the thing and be productive in it much faster. I would not have been able to deploy a bunch of the T3 chat stuff on Cloudflare if it wasn't for how much easier the AI made it for me to smooth out the weirdness of their developer experience. And as a result, I'm building more projects, shipping them to more platforms, and doing more work as a whole because the AI is letting me be more productive. I would estimate that of the raw lines of code that are coming out of me right now, I would guess 70 to 80% are AI generated because I'm spinning up random projects all the time on Bolt and V0 because it's fun. It's genuinely enjoyable to do that. And when I have a random problem that I want to solve, I can hop over to V0, generate 5 versions of a thing, copy part of the one I like, go into my editor and tidy it up myself. But for the 30 lines of code I put in my code base, I might have generated 300. I might have generated 3,000. But the amount of code that didn't exist before that now does as a result of me trying to write the same correct 30 lines of code, instead of writing it twice like I would have before, sometimes I'd write the same feature 2 to 3 times just to get it quite right. I might have deleted 100 lines for every 30 I committed. Now it's closer to 1,000, maybe even more. The amount of code I am creating has gone up significantly. When I say that 70% of the code I create is AI, that's because I'm creating 3x more code. That's not because AI is replacing the code I wrote before. It's allowed me to have different workflows that result in more things being created, more code being made, and a whole different process. My skills as a dev have been helpful using these tools, but my skills in reviewing have been way more so. I have reviewed way more code than I have written in my life, and that makes my skill set for this new era of AI tools way better. Because when I finally get V0 to spit out something usable, I can go through and find the parts of the code I want and the ones I don't, rip it, throw it in my code base, and make the changes I want to there. I like the phrasing here that Bot Cooper made. Creating does not equal committing. And I totally agree with that here. There's a meaningful gap between the things I'm creating in V0, the things that I am generating with T3 chat, and the things that I'm actually putting into an existing code base and committing and putting out there. That's not going to be replaced by AI. That's not going to be replaced by somebody who doesn't know how to code. The fact that they can get as far as they can now is awesome, but that is a different thing. And I think we need to be able to acknowledge that the majority of code right now is written by AI. Way over 50% of the code that is coming out today, of the code that exists at the end of today that didn't exist at the end of yesterday, probably 70 to 80% is AI generated, just knowing how popular these tools and technologies are. There's so much changing in the space and the way we build, and the skills of Googling, the skills of piecemealing, the skills of parsing through a pile of shit to find the thing you actually want, that skill is becoming more important than ever. So as silly as it sounds, on one hand, we are replacing the people who just Google all day with AI. But on the other hand, the people who really are finding that skill of finding the needle in the haystack to solve the problem that no one else could quite solve by finding an obscure resource somewhere no one properly understood, finding the one weird line that isn't doing what it's supposed to, and pulling it all together, those people are set more than they've ever been. And I've experienced this in ways I never would have expected. I can't tell you how many times we had some obscure bug in some code base I've barely touched for 2 years. Like, I'll be real, I can't contribute to the upload thing code base right now. It has gotten to a level of complexity and is using tools I'm not as familiar with because Julius has just killed it taking over that project. He is running the infra side. He's running the SDK side. He is the lead of upload thing at this point. But when there's an obscure bug, like a user said that they couldn't download certain files, but they could download others, and they sent me a screenshot, I was able to intuit from the screenshot that the big difference between the files that failed and the ones that didn't is the ones that failed had non-standard English characters, like they had tildes over them and things like that. And I suggested that maybe our serialization layer that would turn the file name uploaded to a key we had on our service, that layer might be handling these characters wrong. And I ended up being right, even though I hadn't read any of the code. That intuition of understanding the layers where things fail, being able to look at a set of information, things that aren't going right, and piece together the places where a failure might be occurring, those skills are so valuable. And I will forever make the argument that those skills, being able to solve a complex problem with lots of layers and identify the individual layers to do that, that's real engineering. The lines of code you write aren't real engineering. Solving complex problems across many different systems without understanding the depth of any of them, that's the skill that makes you an incredible engineer, be it one who builds bridges or one who builds crappy CRUD apps. And now it's not just how you level up. Now it's the essential to be really good at this stuff. As Bob Cooper said here, this is the actual real life experience that AI can't replace. And I, again, totally agree.
There might be an accidental truth here because he didn't say it technically.
Accidental? What do you mean?
Well, what I mean is that I assume from his side, he's actually saying that all companies need to adjust right now. Like all of your engineers are effectively going to be not as valuable. It's actually going to be the tool that they're selling that happens to be where all the value's at. Your engineers are really just the cart driver, but it's the goods that are really, and the cart itself that you kind of want to purchase. But it might just be that, TJ. That is so much overwhelming code going to be generated that people who are not using that or people that are even editing it are so far behind by accident. He is correct. And in 12 months, it will be just so large that it'll be like 0.1% will be hand artisanal code and impossible to keep up with.
Yeah, I guess Prime and I do actually agree here. Oops, didn't watch this yet. I actually had it in my watch later. I am excited to finish this video in the future. But yeah, we're definitely going at it with different angles, but came to the same conclusion that the majority of code that exists on the web and in general in the very near future is going to be AI code. So yeah, hopefully you understand the thing I'm trying to communicate here. The future isn't all hard code being written by AI. It's not our jobs being replaced with these crappy AI chat generators. The future is more things being created by people who aren't devs. Similar to when WordPress happened, suddenly anyone could throw a website online. That's happening again in a way we've never seen. And we need to be able to acknowledge that without pretending that our skills as engineers are no longer relevant. There's an in-between here, and I think that I'm landing somewhere right smack in the middle of what Dario said and how Prime feels, where I don't think people like Prime will be replaced, but I do think they need to change the focus area of their skills. Your ability to write code really fast is not as important anymore. Your ability to solve hard problems and debug weird issues across complex systems, that's never been more important than it is today. Hopefully this helps you better frame the way you think about these things. Let me know what you think. Until next time, peace nerds.